After missing a scheduled check-in during a trip through Utah's rugged canyon lands, two 22-year-old women disappeared without a trace. The prevailing theory among investigators became a tragic hiking accident, but the absence of any evidence was baffling. It was a discovery made by scientists 3 years later, picking up a strange repeating acoustic signal from a narrow canyon. A sound which held the key to what truly happened in that desolate wilderness. The anxiety tightening. Rowan's chest on the evening of October 15, 2019 wasn't a generalized worry. It was precise, tied to the minute the clock ticked past 700 p.m. His daughter, 22-year-old Imogen Vels, was supposed to call. It was a non-negotiable agreement. The safety tether connecting the civilized world of their home to the remote, unforgiving canyon lands of Utah where Imogen was backpacking. This was the end of day 4. According to the meticulously planned itinerary Rowan had pinned to his corkboard, Imogen and her best friend Alicia Kaspari, also 22, should have completed the most grueling segment of their route. They were scheduled to arrive at a small predetermined motel near a rural highway, resupply, and crucially check in. By 8 p.m., the silence in Rowan's house felt amplified. Every mundane noise, the hum of the refrigerator, the settling of the foundation, sounded like the beginning of a phone ringing, only to dissolve into stillness. Rowan had argued vehemently against the trip. He understood the appeal. Both Imogen and Alicia were experienced, competent hikers drawn to the stark beauty and profound isolation of the Utah desert. They had completed numerous trips together. But this expedition was different. It was longer, more remote, delving into areas where cell service was non-existent, and the landscape was a labyrinth of slot canyons and sheer mesas. The risks were substantial when it became clear that he could not forbid his adult daughter from going. Rowan had insisted on stringent precautions. They carried a high-end emergency SOS beacon, a device capable of sending a distress signal via satellite from virtually anywhere. But Rowan, driven by a primal fear of the wilderness his daughter embraced, demanded more. He insisted Imogen carry a handgun. It was, he argued, a last resort against wildlife, mountain lions, or perhaps even more unpredictable threats found in such isolated regions. Imogen, pragmatic and eager to ease her father's fears, had reluctantly agreed, tucking the firearm securely into her pack. Now Rowan paced his living room. The precautions were meant to ensure their safety, yet they hadn't prevented this silence. He picked up his phone, checking his call history one last time. The last contact remained a photo message received 4 days earlier on the morning of October 11th. It was a picture taken just as they were setting out. The image captured Imogen and Alicia reflected in the dusty window of their vehicle at the trail. Imogen on the right wore a vibrant hot pink jacket, a purple headband holding back her hair, sunglasses perched on her head. She held the phone, her expression of playful pout for the camera. Alicia beside her wore a lime green windbreaker and an olive green cap, smiling softly. Behind their reflection, the sun-drenched reddish-orange canyons loomed, the landscape that had now seemingly swallowed them whole. The photo was time-stamped 9:14 a.m. It was the last confirmed sighting of the two women. At 8:30 p.m., Rowan dialed the number for the motel. The desk clerk answered after several rings. Rowan asked if Imogen or Alicia Kaspari had checked in. The clerk checked the register. No one by those names had arrived. The confirmation landed heavily. This wasn't a delay. It was a deviation. Imogen was organized. She kept her promises. Rowan hung up the phone and immediately dialed the local sheriff's department responsible for the region. He explained the situation, emphasizing the missed check-in and the gear they carried. A formal missing persons report was initiated. The vast machinery of search and rescue began to mobilize in the Utah desert. The response to the disappearance of Imogen Vels and Alicia Kaspari was swift, but the terrain they were traversing was notorious among search and rescue personnel. The Utah Canyon lands are not merely empty. They are actively complex, a geological labyrinth designed to confuse and entrap. It is a landscape where scorching days give way to freezing nights, characterized by slot canyons that can run for miles, susceptible to flash floods even when the sky above is clear, and sandstone mesas fractured by sudden unmarked drop-offs. Within 24 hours, a command center was established near the trailhead. The first critical discovery was the women's vehicle. It was found exactly where they had left it, locked and undisturbed. There were no signs of a struggle. No discarded gear, nothing to suggest foul play had occurred before they entered the wilderness. The investigation immediately focused on the route they intended to follow, but the sheer scale of the area was daunting. Helicopters began grid searches from the air, the thrum of their rotors echoing off the canyon walls. They scanned the vast expanses of slick rock and juniper scrub, looking for a flash of color, the pink of Imogen's jacket, the green of Alicia's. On the ground, teams of experienced trackers and SAR volunteers started hiking the known trails. K-9 units were deployed, attempting to pick up a scent trail before the dry desert air wicked away. But the desert yielded nothing. The slick rock terrain made tracking exceedingly difficult, retaining footprints only in intermittent patches of sand or mud, which were scarce in the aid conditions. The complexity of the canyon systems meant that ground teams could pass within yards of someone and never see them. A central troubling question dominated the briefings at the command center. Why hadn't the emergency beacon been activated? Investigators contacted the company that monitored the device. They confirmed the unit was registered to Imogen Vels and appeared operational when they departed. But no distress signal had ever been received. The silence of the beacon was ominous. It suggested a sudden catastrophe, a fall or a rock slide that incapacitated both simultaneously, preventing them from deploying the device. Alternatively, they might be in a location so deep or narrow that the satellite signal could not penetrate the rock. Rowan Vels arrived at the search headquarters, his face etched with exhaustion and a desperate hope. He provided investigators with detailed inventories of their gear. He mentioned the handgun Imogen carried, adding another layer of complexity to the scenarios investigators considered. Had they encountered someone? Weeks dragged on. The intense initial search gradually scaled back as leads dried up and the physical toll on the search teams mounted. The initial media attention began to wane. It seemed the desert was intent on keeping its secrets. It was during this period of dwindling hope in the fifth week of the search that a new, unexpected element emerged, dramatically shifting the focus of the investigation. A specialized tracking team working far off the established trails in a rugged side canyon near the women's planned route stumbled upon evidence of significant recent human activity. It wasn't a typical hiker's camp. The discovery was reported immediately and investigators were airlifted to the site. They found fresh excavation marks, deep scars in the earth that suggested the use of heavy tools or small explosives, discarded chemical containers, specialized drills, and evidence of mineral extraction were found partially concealed under camouflage netting. This was illegal wildcatting, unauthorized mineral prospecting. The discovery electrified the investigation. The remote Utah desert, while seemingly empty, was known to attract individuals who wished to operate outside the bounds of the law. These modern-day prospectors were often transient, sometimes heavily armed and fiercely territorial over their illegal claims. The possibility that Imogen and Alicia had inadvertently stumbled upon such an operation and met with violence as a result was immediately plausible. It offered a terrifying explanation for their complete disappearance and the silence of the beacon. The dynamics of the investigation shifted dramatically. The focus turned from a search and rescue operation to a potential criminal investigation. The atmosphere at the search headquarters grew darker. The abstract fear of the wilderness was replaced by the tangible fear of human malice. Authorities began the difficult task of identifying and tracking down the individuals involved. This was a complex undertaking. These individuals operated entirely off the grid. They used cash burner phones and moved frequently between remote locations across several states. The investigation expanded, involving coordination between local law enforcement, the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, and federal agencies. Investigators spent weeks analyzing the evidence from the wildcatting site. They traced the lot numbers on the chemical containers, attempting to identify where they were purchased. They analyzed tire tracks found near the site, comparing them to databases of vehicles known to be associated with illegal prospecting. They interviewed informants within the shadowy community of wildcatters, seeking any information about recent activity in the area. The effort yielded several persons of interest. Men known for their involvement in wildcatting and their history of violence and confrontations with law enforcement. A multi-state manhunt began. The search area was re-examined, this time looking for signs of a concealed crime scene, a shallow grave, or discarded evidence rather than lost hikers. The focus on the wildcatters provided a narrative that made sense. Rowan Vels, desperate for answers, clung to this theory. If they had been taken, it meant there was a perpetrator to pursue, a focus for his grief and anger. One of the primary suspects was tracked down to a remote compound in Nevada. A tactical team was deployed to execute a search warrant. The tension was high. The suspect was known to be armed and dangerous. The raid was conducted at dawn. The suspect was apprehended without incident, but the search of the compound yielded nothing connecting him to the missing women. He provided a corroborated alibi for the time of the disappearance. Another suspect was located in Arizona. He was interviewed extensively, but investigators found no evidence linking him to the case. One by one, the identified prospectors were located and cleared. The initial discovery of the illegal excavation site, while highly suspicious, ultimately proved to be coincidental. The wildcatting operation had been active, but it appeared to have been abandoned shortly before Imogen and Alicia began their hike. The disappointment was crushing. The effort had consumed valuable time and resources only to lead back to the same agonizing uncertainty. The trail was cold out as the harsh desert winter approached, bringing snow and freezing temperatures to the high desert. The active search operation was officially suspended. The disappearance of Imogen Vels and Alicia Kaspari was classified as a cold case. The prevailing theory among investigators reverted to the initial assessment. The women had suffered a tragic hiking accident in some unknown, inaccessible location. For 3 years, the silence persisted. The summer of 2022 arrived, marking nearly 3 years since Imogen and Alicia had vanished into the Utah wilderness. The case had faded into obscurity. Another tragic file in the archives of unsolved disappearances. Rowan Vels continued his private search, returning to the desert periodically, but the hope of finding them alive had long since evaporated. He sought only closure. The breakthrough, when it came, originated not from law enforcement or a dedicated search effort, but from an entirely unrelated scientific endeavor occurring in a region so remote it had never been considered relevant to the case. Dr. David Pute, a specialist in geoacoustics from a prominent research university, was leading a small team in an extremely isolated section of the Utah desert, miles from the original search zone. Dr. Pute's research was focused on the unique acoustic properties of the canyonlands. His team was studying how microseismic tremors, the subtle constant vibrations of the Earth's crust, propagated through the complex geological formations of the sandstone. They were attempting to map the subsurface structure by analyzing how these tremors resonated within the rock. This required highly specialized, incredibly sensitive equipment and an environment free from the acoustic pollution of human activity. The team had spent several days hiking into a deep, narrow slot canyon. The environment was otherworldly. The walls were sheer, rising hundreds of feet above them, the space so narrow in places that they had to turn sideways to pass through. The light was dim, the air cool and still. It was a place of profound natural silence, ideal for their acoustic measurements. They were in the process of calibrating their primary instrument, a ruggedized portable spectrum analyzer known as a Sine Soundbook Mark II. This device connected to a series of specialized microphones and sensors driven into the rock was capable of detecting acoustic signals far beyond the range of human hearing, both subsonic and ultrasonic. Dr. Pute monitored the display as the calibration sequence initiated. The screen of the Soundbook Mark II lit up, casting a sterile glow on the orange sandstone walls. It displayed the incoming data in a series of complex graphs and numerical readouts. He expected to see the familiar patterns of low-frequency background noise, the subtle whispers of the earth. Instead, the device registered an intense, unexpected anomaly. The readings indicated a powerful, persistent signal, but it wasn't in the audible spectrum. It was localized, seemingly emanating from the rock itself, concentrated in the high-frequency range. The signal was ultrasonic, far above the threshold of human hearing. But on the device, it was screaming. The numerical readouts spiked, 57.6 and 53.8 displayed prominently, indicating a volume level that far exceeded any natural background noise. Dr. Pute frowned, assuming an equipment malfunction. "Check the probe connection," he instructed his assistant. The assistant verified the connection of the slender metallic microphone probe. It was secure. He ran the calibration sequence again. The signal persisted, a sharp, unwavering peak on the spectrum analyzer. He checked the sensors driven into the rock. Everything was functioning correctly. The equipment was detecting a real signal, a sound that was omnipresent in the silent canyon, yet entirely inaudible to them. The team spent the next several hours trying to triangulate the source of the signal. They moved the sensors, analyzing the subtle shifts in the signal strength and frequency. The signal was unusual not only in its intensity, but in its consistency. Natural geological resonances tend to fluctuate, modulated by wind, temperature, and seismic activity. This signal was stable, mechanical in its precision. It felt distinctly artificial. It was baffling and intriguing. Dr. Pute logged the data meticulously, noting the precise coordinates and the characteristics of the signal. Initially, he suspected it might be an unusual geological phenomenon, perhaps a piezoelectric effect caused by the immense pressure on the quartz crystals within the sandstone, or perhaps interference from a distant communication tower being channeled through the rock in a freak occurrence. They concluded their measurements and hiked out of the canyon, the mystery of the silent scream unresolved, an abstract curiosity in their data logs. Several days later, the research team relocated to a different area several miles away as part of their broader survey. This new location was characterized by a different geological formation, a high mesa scarred by historical mining activity. The area was dotted with dilapidated, unmarked, abandoned mines, relics of a bygone era of mineral extraction. These mines were notoriously dangerous, their structures unstable, and their shafts often concealed by vegetation or debris. The team was surveying an area near one of these abandoned mining complexes, preparing to take a new set of baseline acoustic measurements. They set up the soundbook mark II. As the device powered up. The screen flickered to life and immediately the anomaly reappeared. It was the exact same high-frequency acoustic signature they had recorded in the slot canyon miles away. The intensity was lower here, but the frequency was identical. The silent scream had followed them. Dr. Pute felt a sudden chill despite the desert heat. The realization hit him that the signal was not a localized geological phenomenon. It was being broadcast, and the unique geology of the region was channeling the sound, allowing it to travel through the rock over long distances. Slot Canyon, with its narrow confines and sheer walls, had acted as a natural amplifier, focusing the signal where they first detected it. He began to investigate the immediate vicinity, focusing on the abandoned mine complex. The main entrance of the mine was a dark gaping maw in the side of the mesa. The old wooden supports that framed the entrance were rotted and splintered. As he approached, cautiously testing the ground, he noticed something alarming. The supports appeared to have failed, causing a collapse inward. The ground around the entrance was disturbed, suggesting that significant weight had caused the failure. Punching through the fragile surface into the darkness below. It didn't look like the slow decay of time. It looked like a structural failure. The combination of the acoustic signal and the structural damage created an unsettling possibility. Was it possible someone was trapped down there? The idea seemed remote, yet the persistent signal suggested an electronic device was active underground. Dr. Pute carefully circled the collapsed opening, scanning the ground for any other clues. The area was covered in a thick layer of dust and debris, making it difficult to distinguish recent disturbances from the general decay of the site. He moved slowly, his eyes sweeping the ground. Then, partially obscured by a clump of dried sagebrush near the edge of the collapse, he saw it. It wasn't mining equipment. It was a specialized water filtration straw, a piece of high-end hiking equipment designed for emergency survival. It was relatively modern, weathered, but intact. The discovery of the hiking gear changed everything. The abstract scientific anomaly suddenly became a potential human tragedy. Dr. Pute knew that hikers went missing in the desert frequently. The filtration straw combined with the collapsed mine entrance and the persistent electronic signal painted a grim picture he immediately retrieved the team's satellite phone and alerted the authorities. He explained the situation with urgency, describing the acoustic anomaly, the collapsed mine, and the discovery of the hiking gear. He provided the precise coordinates of the location. The authorities, recognizing the potential significance of the find in this remote region, initiated an immediate response. While waiting for the arrival of the rescue team, they cross-referenced the description of the water filtration straw against the database of missing persons. They pulled the cold case file for Imogen Vels and Alicia Kaspari. The specialized brand and model were rare. It matched the gear inventory provided by Rowan Vels in 2019. After 3 years of silence, the desert had finally yielded a clue, not in the form of a footprint or a distress signal, but as an electronic scream detected by scientists looking for something else entirely. The coordinates provided by Dr. Pute led authorities to one of the most remote and inaccessible regions of the Utah desert. The positive match of the filtration straw to the gear carried by Imogen and Alicia galvanized the cold case investigation. The possibility that the women had fallen into the abandoned mine and that the acoustic signal indicated active electronic equipment demanded an immediate and specialized response. A specialized mine rescue team composed of highly trained professionals experienced in navigating the unique dangers of underground environments was dispatched to the location. They arrived at the site within 24 hours. Their heavy equipment airlifted in by helicopter. The scene they encountered was daunting. The abandoned mine was old, its history unknown, and its structure unmapped. The collapsed entrance where Dr. Pute had observed the inward failure of the supports was highly unstable. The surrounding rock was fractured, and the remaining wooden supports were severely deteriorated. Any attempt to enter the mine without stabilizing the entrance risked triggering a secondary collapse, burying both the potential victims and the rescuers. The rescue operation began with a meticulous and dangerous stabilization effort. The team used pneumatic shores, cribbing, and bracing materials to secure the entrance and the initial section of the mine shaft. The work was slow, conducted under the constant threat of structural failure. The air emerging from the mine was cool and stale, carrying the scent of dust, decay, and damp earth. While the stabilization work was underway, the rescue team deployed their own acoustic monitoring equipment, confirming the presence of the high-frequency signal detected by Dr. Pute. The signal was stronger here, echoing within the confined space of the mine shaft. It was an eerie sensation standing in the silent desert, knowing that the equipment was detecting a sound that their ears could not perceive. A sound that had been broadcasting continuously for 3 years. Once the entrance was deemed sufficiently stable, the rescue team began their descent. The initial section of the mine was a steep rubble-strewn incline, the remnants of the collapse that had likely trapped the women. The darkness was absolute, pierced only by the beams of their headlamps. The air was thick with dust, limiting visibility and requiring the use of respirators. The sound of their breathing apparatuses and the crunch of their boots on the loose rock were the only sounds in the oppressive silence as they moved deeper into the mine. They began to find evidence of human passage, footprints in the dust. Disturbed rocks and discarded items confirmed that someone had been there. The trail led them through a series of narrow winding tunnels, deeper into the heart of the massa. The environment was claustrophobic. The weight of the rock above them, a constant palpable pressure, about 100 yards into the mine system. In a small chamber shielded from the main tunnel, they made a significant discovery. It was a makeshift camp. The scene told a story of desperate survival. The beams of their headlamps swept over the area, illuminating the remnants of a prolonged ordeal. Empty food wrappers, the specialized packaging used for dehydrated backpacking meals, were scattered on the dusty floor. Depleted batteries, dozens of them, were piled in a corner, indicating they had used their light sources extensively. 2 sleeping bags were laid out, one partially covered by a thick layer of dust. The discovery confirmed the investigators' grim theory. Imogen and Alicia had survived the initial fall. They had likely been walking over the poorly supported ground near the mine entrance when it gave way, plunging them into the darkness below. Trapped underground with no way to climb out through the collapsed entrance, they had established this camp, pooling their resources and attempting to survive. Analysis of the scene suggested they had lived underground for a significant period, likely weeks. The amount of consumed supplies indicated a prolonged effort to ration their food and water. They had tried to survive in the absolute darkness, waiting for a rescue that never came. The atmosphere in the chamber was heavy with the tragedy of their ordeal. The rescuers moved through the scene carefully, documenting the evidence, the silence broken only by the occasional radio communication with the surface. The acoustic signal persisted louder now, drawing them deeper into the mine. The rescue team used their equipment to trace the sound, following the echoes through the labyrinthine tunnels. The signal seemed to be emanating from a section of the mine that had suffered a significant internal collapse. They pinpointed the origin of the signal, lodged in the debris of the collapse. Partially crushed by a fallen boulder was the emergency SOS beacon. The device was still active, its small LED indicator light flashing weakly in the darkness, a testament to the longevity of its battery. The discovery of the beacon solved the mystery of the silent scream. Investigators examined the device, analyzing the damage and the nature of the malfunction. They determined that the impact of the fall or the subsequent collapse had caused a critical failure in the device's internal circuitry. The transmitter was damaged, rendering it incapable of broadcasting a standard distress signal on the designated emergency frequency. Instead, the damaged electronics were emitting a continuous, weak, high-frequency electronic noise, the ultrasonic scream. This malfunction explained why the beacon had never been detected by the monitoring center. It was broadcasting on the wrong frequency, a signal that was inaudible to humans and invisible to standard emergency receivers. But the unique geology of the region had intervened. The sandstone formations, with their specific density and composition, acted as a natural amplifier and conduit, channeling the ultrasonic signal through the rock, allowing it to be detected miles away in the slot canyon where Dr. Pute and his team had first recorded. Investigators theorized that the women had connected their high-capacity solar power bank, originally intended for charging phones, during their multi-day trek to the damaged beacon in a desperate attempt to keep it operational, enabling the weak signal to persist far longer than the device's internal battery would have allowed. The beacon had been screaming for help for 3 years, but the technology had failed them in the most cruel and unusual way. The discovery of the damaged beacon explained why no distress signal was ever received. The women likely attempted to activate it unaware that it was malfunctioning. They waited for help, trusting in a technology that had failed them. With the source of the signal identified, the search for the women continued. The atmosphere inside the mine grew heavier. The evidence at the camp suggested a desperate struggle for survival, but the absence of the women indicated a tragic end. The rescue team continued their search, moving past the beacon, deeper into the increasingly hazardous mine system. The tunnels became narrower, the air quality deteriorating, and then the cadaver dog accompanying the team alerted intensely. The dog focused on a specific area ahead. The team approached cautiously. They were met with a scene of catastrophic destruction. A massive internal collapse had completely blocked the tunnel. Tons of boulders and rock had fallen from the ceiling, creating an impassable barrier. The dog alerted again. Focusing on the base of the collapse, the team began the painstaking process of examining the debris field, their lights cutting through the dust. And then they saw it, a flash of color amidst the dull gray rock. It was the distinctive hot pink fabric of Imogen's jacket. They had found her. Imogen's body was trapped under tons of boulders. The nature of the collapse was immediately apparent. Imogen had been caught in the secondary collapse. The weight of the rock had crushed her instantly. Based on the layers of dust and the state of the remains, the collapse had occurred long ago, likely shortly after the women established their camp. The discovery confirmed the tragic fate of one of the women. The search for Alicia Kaspari continued, but the discovery of Imogen's body cast a dark shadow over the operation. If Alicia had been at the camp when the collapse occurred, she would have been left alone in the absolute darkness with the body of her best friend. The report from the mine rescue team leader to the surface was delivered with professional finality, but the implications were devastating. Imogen had been located, but recovery was impossible. The structural instability of the mine, particularly in the area of the collapse that entombed her body, was too severe. The assessment concluded that any attempt to excavate the remains would be a life-threatening operation with a high probability of triggering a ability and fenfa. Catastrophic secondary collapse. The news hit Rowan Vels with the force of a physical blow. After 3 years of agonizing uncertainty, the confirmation of his daughter's death was a brutal closure. But the inability to recover her body to bring her home and lay her to rest added a layer of agonizing cruelty to the tragedy. Authorities made the difficult decision to bring Rowan to the mine site. They needed him to understand the reality of the situation to see the treacherous environment for himself. He arrived by helicopter, the desolate landscape unfolding beneath him. The mine, a scar on the earth, was now the center of a somber operation. At the entrance of the mine, the rescue team leader explained the situation, using diagrams and sensor data to illustrate the instability of the underground structure. He detailed the risks involved in any recovery attempt. It was a conversation no parent should ever have to endure. While the recovery of Imogen's body was impossible, the rescue team had managed to retrieve a crucial piece of evidence. Imogen's backpack had been partially accessible near the edge of the collapse zone. They had carefully extracted it during their initial survey and brought it to the surface. Inside the backpack, amidst the remaining supplies and personal items, they found the handgun Rowan had insisted she carry. It was secured in its holster, fully loaded. It had not been fired. It confirmed that she had not faced a threat from wildlife or other humans before the collapse. Her death was a tragic accident, a consequence of the treacherous environment. Rowan, standing at the entrance of the mine that had claimed his daughter's life, was faced with an agonizing decision. The authorities proposed sealing the mine permanently to prevent future tragedies and to secure the site. It meant accepting that Imogen would remain underground, entombed in the darkness. With a heavy heart, Rowan agreed. It was the only way to ensure that no one else would be endangered by the unstable mine. He requested that the mine be sealed completely, transforming it into Imogen's final resting place. A few days later, demolition experts arrived at the site. They strategically placed explosive charges at the entrance of the mine, calculating the blast to cause a controlled collapse that would seal the opening entirely. The detonation echoed through the canyons, a final thunderous punctuation to the tragedy. The entrance collapsed, sealing the mine permanently. The dust settled and the silence returned. With the mine sealed and Imogen's fate confirmed, the investigation shifted its focus entirely to Alicia Kaspari. The discovery of the makeshift camp proved that Alicia had also fallen into the mine and survived the initial ordeal. The analysis of the camp suggested that both women were alive for several weeks underground. The critical question now was what happened to Alicia? Investigators hypothesized that the collapse that killed Imogen had occurred while both women were in the mine. If Alicia had been elsewhere in the tunnel system at the time, she might have survived the collapse, only to find herself trapped alone in the darkness. The search of the accessible parts of the mine had found no trace of Alicia's body. This suggested two possibilities. Either her body was buried in an inaccessible section of the mine, perhaps in the same collapse that killed Imogen, or she had found another way out. The latter possibility seemed unlikely. The mine was old and complex, but the main entrance was the only known exit. However, the investigators refused to dismiss the possibility. If Alicia had escaped the mine, the trajectory of the case would change dramatically. To explore this possibility, investigators commissioned an aerial LiDAR survey of the area. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, is a remote sensing method that uses pulsed laser light to measure distances to the Earth. It can penetrate vegetation and create detailed three-dimensional maps of the terrain, revealing subtle features that might be missed by traditional aerial photography. The LiDAR survey mapped the underground structure of the mine, revealing the extent of the tunnel system and identifying potential anomalies. The analysis of the data revealed something unexpected. On the opposite side of the mesa from the main entrance, the survey identified a narrow vertical shaft extending from the underground tunnels to the surface. This was likely an old ventilation shaft designed to circulate air in the mine. It was too narrow for a person to easily climb. But in a desperate situation, it might offer a potential escape route. A ground team was dispatched to the location of the ventilation shaft. The top of the shaft was a small, inconspicuous opening in the rock, partially obscured by brush. It would have been nearly impossible to spot without the precise coordinates provided by the LiDAR survey. The team scrutinized the opening, looking for any sign of human passage. The rock around the edge of the shaft was rough and weathered. Then they saw it. Caught on a sharp protrusion of rock just inside the opening of the shaft were minute traces of fabric fibers. The fibers were carefully collected and sent for forensic analysis. The results were stunning. The fibers were synthetic, consistent with the material used in high-performance outdoor gear, and the color was a distinctive lime green. The analysis confirmed that the fibers matched the distinctive green hiking jacket Alicia Kaspari was wearing when she disappeared. The discovery was a paradigm shift. Alicia Kaspari had escaped the mine. The timeline was reconstructed based on the evidence found at the camp and the estimated rate of decomposition of Imogen's body. Investigators theorized that Alicia had managed to climb the ventilation shaft sometime around November 2019. Likely driven by desperation after the collapse that killed Imogen and the depletion of their supplies. She had survived weeks underground, endured the trauma of witnessing her best friend's death, and managed a seemingly impossible escape from the darkness. She had emerged onto the surface alive. The mystery deepened. If Alicia escaped the mine in November 2019, why did she never reach civilization? The desert was vast and harsh, but she was an experienced hiker, resourceful and determined. She should have been able to navigate to the nearest road or settlement. The investigation was no longer about a tragic accident in an abandoned mine. It was about what happened to Alicia Kaspari after she emerged from the darkness, alone and desperate, into the empty expanse of the Utah desert. The confirmation of Alicia Kaspari's escape reignited the investigation with a new sense of urgency. The focus shifted from the sealed mine to the vast empty landscape surrounding it. A renewed search was launched, radiating outward from the ventilation shaft exit. Investigators tried to reconstruct Alicia's likely path. She would have emerged onto the surface, malnourished, dehydrated, and traumatized. Her gear was depleted, and the emergency SOS beacon was damaged and left behind in the mine. She was alone in the middle of nowhere with winter approaching. The search teams meticulously scanned the terrain looking for any sign of her passage. But the trail was 3 years cold. The desert environment with its relentless wind and occasional flash floods had long since erased any footprints or discarded items. The search yielded nothing. The investigation stalled again. The mystery of Alicia's fate remained unsolved. Had she succumbed to the elements, her body lost in the vast wilderness, or had something else happened? The breakthrough came several months later in early 2023 from an unexpected source. A Bureau of Land Management (BLM) surveyor was working in the area documenting illegal fencing on public land. The remote regions of the Utah desert were a patchwork of public and private land, and disputes over boundaries and grazing rights were common. The surveyor was tracing a contested fence line bordering a large, isolated ranch. This area was far from any roads characterized by rolling hills and sparse vegetation. The ranch was known for its reclusive owner, who fiercely guarded his privacy and property. While documenting a section of the fence line that encroached on public land, the surveyor noticed something unusual. A pile of old tires and ranch debris was visible near the fence, partially concealed in a dry wash. It looked like an illegal dumping site, The surveyor approached the debris pile to document the violation. As he got closer, he noticed a strange odor, a faint scent of decomposition mixed with the smell of old rubber and dust. He began to shift some of the debris, investigating the extent of the dumping. He pulled back an old cracked tire and froze. Beneath the debris, partially buried in the dry earth, was a human skeleton. The surveyor immediately secured the scene and alerted the authorities. The remote location required a specialized forensic team to be dispatched. The remains were carefully excavated and transported to the medical examiner's office. The skeleton was incomplete, scattered by scavengers, but the forensic analysis yielded a positive identification. Through dental records and DNA analysis, the remains were confirmed to be those of Alicia Kaspari. The discovery was devastating. Alicia, who had survived the horrors of the mine, had died in the open desert, her body discarded like trash, under a pile of old tires. The initial assumption was that she had succumbed to the elements shortly after escaping the mine, and her body had been concealed by the shifting sands until the surveyor stumbled upon it. But the autopsy revealed a horrifying twist. The forensic examination determined that Alicia was severely malnourished and dehydrated at the time of her death, consistent with her ordeal in the mine and subsequent exposure. However, the examination also revealed evidence of significant trauma that could not be explained by an accidental death. The skeletal remains showed evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull and ribs inflicted near the time of death. Furthermore, the forensic anthropologist identified subtle fractures and injuries consistent with severe physical and sexual abuse. The case was immediately reclassified as a homicide. Alicia Kaspari had not died of exposure. She had been murdered. The realization sent shockwaves through the investigation. The narrative of a tragic hiking accident had been shattered. Alicia had survived the mine only to encounter a predator in the remote desert. The investigation now focused on identifying the killer. The location where the remains were found near the border of the isolated ranch immediately drew suspicion towards the owner. But investigators needed concrete evidence linking the ranch to the crime. The remnants of Alicia's clothing, including her distinctive green jacket, were found at the site. They were degraded and weathered, but they held crucial trace evidence. The forensic team meticulously analyzed the fibers, searching for anything that might identify the perpetrator or the location of the crime. The analysis identified unusual trace evidence on the remnants of her clothing. It was not the typical dust and debris expected from the desert environment. Instead, the forensic team found chemical residues of a specific, industrial-grade agricultural disinfectant. This type of disinfectant was commonly used in large-scale livestock operations for cleaning stalls and equipment. It was not something Alicia would have encountered in the wilderness. Furthermore, the analysis identified unique synthetic fibers embedded in the fabric of her jacket. These fibers were not consistent with her own gear. They were specialized high-strength fibers used in the manufacturing of high-end horse-tack saddles, harnesses, and ropes. The combination of the agricultural disinfectant and the specialized horse-tack fibers pointed towards a specific environment, a working ranch specializing in high-quality horses. The discovery of this unique trace evidence was the key breakthrough. It linked Alicia's death to a specific location and provided a direct lead to the perpetrator. The investigation now turned its full attention to the isolated ranch bordering the site where Alicia's remains were found. The desert, which had held its secrets for so long, was finally beginning to reveal the truth about Alicia Kaspari's tragic fate. The unique signature of the trace evidence, the industrial-grade agricultural disinfectant, and the specialized synthetic fibers from high-end horse tack allowed investigators to narrow their focus significantly. These materials were not common in the sparsely populated region. The primary target was the large isolated ranch adjacent to where Alicia Caspari's remains were discovered. The ranch was owned by Sterling Bracken. Bracken, in his late 50s, was a reclusive figure known locally as fiercely territorial and hostile toward outsiders. He lived alone on the sprawling property, managing a small but high-quality horse breeding operation. Bracken had a reputation for being abrasive and volatile. A background check revealed a prior criminal record for assault stemming from a violent dispute over grazing rights. Several years earlier, Bracken immediately became the prime suspect. The location of the body, the trace evidence matching his ranching operation, and his known propensity for violence created a compelling circumstantial case. Detectives arrived at Bracken's ranch to interview him. The property was isolated, the main house situated several miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a rough dirt track. The atmosphere at the ranch was oppressive, the silence broken only by the sound of the wind and the occasional whinny of a horse. Bracken met the detectives at the entrance to his property. He was defensive and uncooperative from the outset, demanding to know why they were there and refusing to allow them access to the main house. The interview was conducted in the open air near the entrance gate. The detectives gradually revealed the purpose of their visit, explaining that they were investigating the disappearance of Alicia Caspari. Bracken claimed to have no knowledge of the missing woman. Then the detectives confronted him with the discovery of Alicia's remains near his fence line. Bracken's demeanor shifted. He became visibly agitated, his defensiveness turning into calculated evasion. He realized he needed to provide an explanation for the presence of the body. After a long pause, he admitted to encountering Alicia in late 2019. Bracken's narrative was carefully constructed. He claimed he was checking his fence line when he found Alicia wandering in the desert, delirious and severely injured. He said she was barely alive, suffering from severe malnutrition and exposure. He claimed he tried to help her. He brought her back to his ranch, intending to take her to the nearest town for medical assistance, but he claimed she succumbed to her injuries. Shortly after arrival, Bracken stated that he panicked. He knew about the missing hikers and he feared that his criminal record would lead authorities to blame him for her death. He made the fateful decision to hide the body, concealing it under the pile of tires and debris near the fence line, hoping it would never be found. Bracken's story was plausible on the surface. It explained how Alicia's body ended up on his property and acknowledged his role in concealing her death. But the detectives were skeptical. Bracken's demeanor was too controlled, his narrative too convenient, and his story did not explain the evidence of blunt force trauma and sexual abuse found on Alicia's remains. The detectives pressed him on the details of her injuries. Bracken became evasive again, claiming he didn't remember the specifics, that she was already severely injured when he found her. The detectives knew they needed more evidence to break through Bracken's carefully constructed facade. They secured a search warrant for his property based on the trace evidence and the proximity of the body. The search of the ranch was extensive. The property was large with multiple outbuildings, barns, and storage sheds. The investigators focused on the areas where Bracken might have held Alicia captive. They zeroed in on a remote, unused bunkhouse situated far from the main house near the horse stables. The bunkhouse appeared dilapidated and abandoned from the outside. But as the investigators entered, they were hit by an overwhelming odor. It was the smell of the agricultural disinfectant, the same chemical residue found on Alicia's clothing. The odor was strong, suggesting a recent aggressive cleaning attempt. The bunkhouse had been stripped bare, the furniture removed, the floors scrubbed clean. But the pervasive smell of the disinfectant indicated that something had happened here, something Bracken wanted to conceal. The investigators meticulously processed the scene using specialized techniques to detect latent evidence. They used luminol to search for bloodstains, but the aggressive cleaning had removed any trace. The breakthrough came during a detailed search of the structure itself. One of the investigators noticed a loose floorboard near the back wall of the bunkhouse. He carefully lifted the board. Beneath the floorboard, hidden in the dark cavity, they found them. Restraints. They were not standard handcuffs or ropes. They were fashioned from the same specialized horse-tack material found on Alicia's remains. The unique synthetic fibers matched perfectly. The discovery of the restraints shattered Bracken's narrative. They were clear evidence of captivity and abuse. Alicia had not died naturally shortly after arriving at the ranch. She had been held captive, restrained, and abused. The evidence suggested a horrific sequence of events. Alicia, desperate and vulnerable after escaping the mine, had encountered Sterling Bracken. But instead of helping her, Bracken saw her desperation as an opportunity. He had abducted her, taken her to the remote bunkhouse, and subjected her to prolonged abuse. The blunt force trauma indicated that she had fought back or that Bracken had become violent. The exact circumstances of her death remained unclear, but the evidence strongly suggested that Bracken had murdered her, either intentionally or as a result of the abuse. The discovery of the restraints combined with the trace evidence and the autopsy findings provided the definitive proof needed to charge Sterling Bracken with the kidnapping, sexual abuse, and murder of Alicia Kaspari. The opportunist who had preyed on the vulnerable and relied on the isolation of the desert to conceal his crimes had finally been brought to justice. The trial of Sterling Bracken began in mid-2023, nearly 4 years after Alicia Kaspari's disappearance. The case had captured the attention of the regional media. The horrific details of the dual tragedy captivating and appalling the public. The courtroom was tense. Rowan Vels sat in the front row, his face etched with grief. Representing both his daughter Imogen and her best friend Alicia, Sterling Bracken remained stoic throughout the proceedings. He maintained his refusal to confess, sticking to his original narrative that Alicia had died of natural causes and he had simply panicked and concealed the body. The prosecution presented a meticulous and overwhelming case, weaving together the circumstantial evidence, the forensic findings, and the timeline of events. They painted a devastating picture of the two women's ordeal. They described the initial accident, the fall into the abandoned mine, the desperate struggle for survival in the darkness. They detailed the discovery of the makeshift camp and the damaged SOS beacon, the electronic scream that had gone unheard for 3 years. They recounted the tragic death of Imogen, crushed in the cave-in, her body forever entombed in the sealed mine. Then the prosecution focused on Alicia Kaspari's remarkable escape, the climb up the ventilation shaft, the emergence onto the surface, alive but vulnerable. They emphasized the horrific twist of fate. Alicia, having survived the impossible, only to encounter Sterling Bracken. The prosecution argued that Bracken saw Alicia's desperate state not as a cry for help, but as an opportunity. He had abducted her, taken her to the remote bunkhouse on his ranch, and subjected her to unimaginable abuse. The key evidence was the unique trace evidence found on Alicia's remains. The agricultural disinfectant and the specialized horse-tack fibers linked her directly to Bracken's ranch. The prosecution presented expert testimony explaining the rarity of these materials and the significance of their presence on her clothing. The climax of the trial was the presentation of the restraints found hidden under the floorboard in the bunkhouse. The prosecution displayed the restraints to the jury. The specialized horse-tack material matching the fibers found on Alicia's remains. This physical evidence directly contradicted Bracken's narrative and strongly suggested captivity and abuse. The defense attempted to create reasonable doubt, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that there was no definitive proof that Bracken had murdered Alicia. They emphasized the lack of DNA evidence linking Bracken to the crime, attributing it to the degradation of the remains and the aggressive cleaning of the bunkhouse. But the totality of the evidence was too compelling. The combination of the location of the body, the trace evidence, the autopsy findings indicating sexual abuse and blunt force trauma, and the discovery of the restraints created a narrative that was impossible to ignore. After several days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Sterling Bracken was found guilty on all counts: kidnapping, sexual abuse, and felony murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The case closed on the dual tragedy uncovered by the anomalous sound of a damaged SOS beacon. The chance discovery by the acoustic researchers had set in motion a chain of kins of Ladina, events that revealed the horrifying truth about the disappearance of Imogen Villes and Alicia. Imogen Villes remains entombed within the sealed Utah mine, her final resting place marked only by the vast silent expanse of the desert. A decision made by her father Rowan to protect others from the same fate. Alicia Kaspari survived the initial ordeal, emerging from the darkness with a fierce will to live, only to meet a horrific end at the hands of an opportunistic predator in the remote, unforgiving wilderness.